So I'd like to introduce Cynthia Minster and her magnificent thesis that I've been privileged to read. It's scholarly and deep and complex, and I will urge all of you to read it. The title of her presentation is Internal Growth, Human Relationships, and Reaching Towards God, the Concurrent Development of Ethics and Mysticism in Early Modern Jewish Texts. She chooses to go through three traditional ancient texts, medieval texts, Devorah, Mesillat Yesharim, and Nefesh HaChayim. I'm not going to take away any time from her presentation, but this is a very deep scholarly presentation. Thank you, Cynthia, for working on it and bringing it to us.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Gottlieb, for your beautiful words. Let me share my presentation with you all. So this is indeed the of my thesis. It is, I understand, a mouthful. We don't have much time together. So hopefully in this presentation, I'm going to help you understand how I got to the title. So when I started out being an adult, I had a pretty low bar for understanding Judaism. I often actually called myself culturally, not religiously Jewish. And my reasons for being Jewish were first and foremost family, cultural, and ethnic ties. Going forward, why to join a synagogue? Well, to make sure your kids aren't jerks, and perhaps maybe for community. When I was leading a Shiva Minyan for my grandmother, Elsie Rubenstein Minster, Zichronah Livracha, afterwards, my uncle Paul Brooks invited me to check out his synagogue. He thought I would like it. And it took me a year to take him up on the offer. And when I did, I was blown away. I was introduced to intellectual Judaism and to sermons that did not dumb down ideas for me, that there was actually something within Judaism that could hold my interest. And so through Rabbi Mordechai Finley and Ora HaTorah, I was welcomed into understanding Jewish mysticism and ethics. And so what I was, you can actually Judaism, self-actual person I want to be, and to strive towards goodness and wholeness, and to connect
Cynthia,
with holiness.
Cynthia, your internet is cutting out a little bit, so let's try turning off your video and see if that improves it.
Okay, so that just went back on. So
much better.
Right. So great. So hopefully you heard me say, and you can reply, self-actualization and growing into the person to be. So that is not, apologies. Okay. So what is ethics and mysticism, or as I came to start calling it in my early years at AJR, ethical mysticism? On a Peshat level, we can understand ethics as regarding internal growth and human relationships, and mysticism as being the part about reaching towards God. I then went searching for some more robust definitions of these terms, and Max Kedushin, in his seminal work, Worship and Ethics, describes Jewish ethics as to designate what today we call the ethical sphere. The rabbis employ the concept of derech eretz, literally the way of the world, without defining that term. We regard ethics not as a system thought out by a philosopher, but as a pattern of concepts developed by society. My heart sang when I read this, because honestly, trying to understand academic philosophy is a little bit beyond me, but reaching into the Jewish worldview is what makes complete sense to me. So all of my definitions are going to be coming from looking at Judaism in particular. In an essay in the Cambridge Companion to the Talmud and Rabbinic Literature, Jonathan Wynne Schofer wrote that Jewish ethical writing begins with an understanding of the human condition. Rabbis were concerned with describing the emotions and desires in their spontaneous or unreformed states. These impulses were collected into the terms Yetzer HaTov, the inclination towards goodness, and Yetzer Hara, the inclination towards evil or destructiveness. Next, descriptions were given of ideal actions and states of character, the ultimate goal or telos of self-cultivation. Honestly, I had no idea any of this existed in Judaism. The only thing I had heard of virtues was something in horror movies connected to the 7 deadly sins. Okay, so the final definition that I have for Jewish ethical literature is from Joseph Dan's seminal work, Jewish Mysticism and Jewish Ethics. It's dealing with practical consequences of religious adherence in the realm of daily behavior, both between man and God and between man and men, ritualistic as well as social ethics. Now, this muddies the waters a little bit, and we get a little bit more muddy in the waters. I apologize, mysticism is a esoteric knowledge level, so here is how Joseph Dan describes it. Jewish mysticism, like any other mysticism, is based on the deep religious belief that divine truth can be neither found nor expressed in worldly terms. Divine truth lies in a mystical realm, completely hidden from human senses and rationalistic analysis. The only bridge between language and the mystical realm of divine truth is the symbol, a term of language which expounds not what is known, but what is unknown. A symbol in a mystical context is the maximum possible approach that language can achieve toward a truth which in itself can never be reached, which lies eternally beyond human understanding and expression. This is the reason that you can go into the depths of Kabbalah and come out with different understandings every day, because you come towards it with a different version of yourself, and the refraction of the divine that comes towards you is different. So there is obviously a thin line between ethics and mysticism. Combining the explanations of Jewish ethics, it's concerned about internal growth, character, human relationships, social, and religious ideals, ritual. If ritualistic ethics refers to a person's relationship with God, then the point of distinction between ritualistic ethics and mysticism could potentially disappear. I see imitatio Dei, the desire to imitate God in one's actions, as a clearer understanding of the divine realm of ethics. Simultaneously, there is some discrepancy in how writers describe the mystical realm of Jewish thought and practice. So thus, within a Jewish worldview, ethics and mysticism have a symbiotic relationship. Our understanding of the divine is often proclaimed through our interactions with other people. Our ability to connect with Hashem is always heightened by communal gatherings, which is why some prayers may only be recited in the presence of a minyan, a quorum of 10 adult Jews. Throughout Jewish history, ethics and mysticism have been integral aspects of the Jewish mind, though those terms themselves are rarely employed. So the first person that I looked at was the Ramak Moses Cordovero and his book Tomer Devorah. He lived 1522 to 1570. Now he's called the Ramak. For many of our greatest rabbis, we make abbreviations of their names, always beginning with R, because we are recognizing that they were rabbis, and then their first and last name, Moshe Cordovero, which you can see written here in Hebrew, gets you to Ramak. He made the first full integration of rivaling Kabbalistic schools in a larger work called Elimah Rabbati, and Tomer Devorah is one part of the larger collection. It is translated means the palm tree of Deborah. He goes through each of the sphirot in the 10 emanations of the divine, which are a roadmap to reality. It could be said a template for understanding how to reach towards God. And it makes it very easy to understand how each of those named aspects of the divine connect with human actions. It is a favorite book to introduce people to Kabbalah, though many of our professors would be shocked to know how difficult it can be for people to relate to because it is of its time and it is not the it is not at all a feminist work. So Joseph Dan describes it as, this small treatise is the first in which a systemic presentation of everyday ethical behavior is completely dependent on the idea that one's needs should reflect the inner structure of the deity as found in Kabbalistic symbolism, which means the Sphirot. The next person and work that I looked at was Rabbi Moses Chaim Luzzatto and Mesillat Yesharim. He lived around 1707 to 1746. He was born in Padua, Italy, and he is known as the Ramchal because, as his name says in Hebrew, Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, you get Ramchal. So there has been more written about the Ramchal than either of the other teachers that I read from, because he really was at the forefront of transitioning us from the previous eras of Judaism into the modern era. He is one of the founders of modern Hebrew. He wrote both plays and poetry in addition to Kabbalistic and this ethical work, and people love to connect with his use of the Hebrew language and with his Kabbalistic narratives. So he led this Kabbalistic circle open to outsiders in his hometown of Padua, even though he wasn't the oldest person there, but they recognized his brilliance. And one of his disciples wrote a letter home to seek additional funds for the Ramchal. And he was really just enamored with everything he was learning. And he thought everyone needs to know this Torah. Well, that letter led to the condemnation of Ramchal and forced him to move out of his native Italy. No one in the Ashkenazic world would accept him, and he ended up settling in Amsterdam among Portuguese Jews. He wrote Mesillat Yesharim at 31. He actually wrote it as a conversation between a chassid and a chacham, a wise person who was standing in for the traditional rabbinate of his time. It was a bit more polemical with that conversation structure. You can read it in English. And he was involved in the editing process, which stripped away what made it look a little bit like it was taking off the same format as the Kuzari. And he focused solely on it as an ethical treatise that was explaining a Baraita. And it quickly became everyone's favorite ethical text. He moved, unfortunately, for us, that he moved to Acre, Israel at the age of 36 and died along with his wife and child in a plague at 39. So his book is an explanation of this Baraita, which is found in the Talmud. A Baraita is something that was written at an earlier time that was not included in the Mishnah. And this is what it says. From here, Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair said, Torah brings one to vigilance. Vigilance brings one to alacrity. Alacrity brings one to spiritual cleanliness. Cleanliness brings one to abstinence. Abstinence brings one to purity. Purity brings one to piety. Piety brings one to humility. Humility brings one to fear of sin. Fear of sin brings one to holiness. Holiness brings one to divine inspiration. Divine inspiration brings one to the resurrection of the dead. So it is a bit, most people are like, how do you find any mysticism in this work? It is clearly solely ethical. Well, the thing is that when I was trying to figure out why it is that all of these men wrote about the male Sphirot in such an active way and the female ones in such a passive way, and why they put all the negative energy on what they described as female aspects of the divine, that led me to reading Elliot Wolfson's essay on some of the Ramchal's work, where he posits that the androgen, who is the ideal nature of man as described in the Sphirot, is actually a male androgen where the female aspects are subsumed into the male, and that this is further related to the way that people understood how procreation worked. That idea was expanded by Sharon Faye Cohen in her book, The Menstruant, Forsaken, the Menstruant in Medieval Jewish Mysticism. And so that was a good way of understanding why all that was happening. But unfortunately, I then went on to read Wolfson's book, Venturing Beyond Law and Morality in Kabbalistic Mysticism. And I've never written so many disagreeing with an author notes in the margins as I did with this book. So as a palate cleanser, I read Moshe Idel's Kabbalah and Eros to have a more holistic look at this. Really, the Wolfson began life in a yeshiva and became a postmodern scholar who uses really anti-Jewish polemics rooted in Christian understanding of the world. And it was a true blessing to me to have had rabbinic training to be able to spot the problematic nature of his writing. So what I did find also was David Sklar wrote his PhD on Mesillat Yesharim, the original version of it, and has published essays about Ramchal. And so I used his work as a counterpoint to what I was doing. And he mentioned in his dissertation that it would be interesting to look at this series of virtues and compare them to the Sefirot, but that it was beyond his dissertation. And I had always thought that there must be something to that because there are 10 virtues in this Baraita. And clearly in my imagination, perhaps, you will never know for sure, there was some connection there. And so it's the imaginative part of my dissertation that in discussing this book, I compare them to the Sefirot. The final book that I wrote about was Nefesh HaChayim. It's probably the most unusual one for this. It was written by Rav Chaim of Volozhin. He lived 1749 to 1821, and he was the chief disciple of the Vilna Gaon. So one of our beloved professors, Rabbi Elijah Shochet, is a descendant of the Vilna Gaon and has told all of us about how the Mitnagdim, the opponents of Hasidism, were not against mysticism. They were actually believers in Lurianic Kabbalah. What they were against was the way that the Hasids brought it forward and the particular things that they were doing that were diminishing the halachic needs to elevate kavanah, intention in one's actions. So Rav Chaim created the Etz Chaim Yeshiva in Volozhin, and then he created, which was the model for modern Orthodox, emphasis on Torah Lishma, Torah for its own sake. And then he wrote Nefesh HaChayim, which means the soul of life, and his book says that the Torah is the soul of life. So the Soul of Life was published posthumously by his son, Reb Itzela. It is comprised of 4 gates. It is a beautifully modern text in that each essay builds upon the one before it towards its ultimate thesis in a very strong way. He also does a very traditionally rabbinic thing in that he doesn't use his own ideas. I think that the people who learn from him in person must have learned a lot more because he relies solely on the tradition in making every one of his points. He pulls from everything from the Bible to the Talmud to the Zohar and on through the books that I read, actually. So gate 1 of his book is about philosophic anthropology, which means a theory of why people exist. And then after that, you get an annotation by his son, which explains some of the Kabbalistic concepts in the first gate. Gate 2 is about prayer. Gate 3 is about theology. Then there are these unbundled chapters that are about Musar, practical and ethical advice. And then finally, the 4th gate is about Torah Lishma. The entire book was not published in vernacular because people were afraid of allowing more people to understand all of these Kabbalistic concepts. And so often it was only the 4th gate that was translated. The first translation made was into French by Levinas, and then came this English translation, which is brilliant. And it is a very delicate translation, which understands that there are words in Hebrew that have more than one meaning and connotation. And then on top of that, I was able to reference a sefer of the book in Hebrew with nekudot when I wanted to really fully grasp some of the concepts within it. And so this one there were two scholars that I referenced in my paper. And the first, Rabbi Dr. Nathan Lamb, his book on only focuses on Torah Lishma and claims that that the ethics are a subset of it. And he really, I feel, missed the point of the entire book when making an argument for Orthodox Judaism. And another scholar wrote about it from a sociological perspective. And so his chapter on it in a book about the Vilna Gaon was instructive, but was not the literary analysis that I wanted to do. And so my chapter on Nefesh HaChayim is a literary analysis of it that really helps to reflect on the ways in which ethics and mysticism are brilliantly combined in this book and compel you towards a life of Judaism. And so when I got to the end of reading all of these people, both the primary and secondary sources, I realized that the thesis that I began with, which was that I was going to be able to find a strong structure that would allow me to show people Judaism from an ethical and mystical standpoint alone, was completely false, that the entire history of our wisdom tradition has three legs: ethics, mysticism, and halacha. And it is the interplay between all three parts that creates an organic whole. Often when you learn about the Talmud, you're told that there is halacha and agadah, that the things that are related to Jewish law are in the halacha, and then everything else is agadah, without actually really getting a definition of what agadah is. And for me, ethics and mysticism are what is in that other stuff that is just so important and is so meaningful to creating a life of meaning and to becoming the person and the people that we're meant to be. So thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much, everybody. Rabbi Mel, do you want to conclude us?
Thank you so much, Cynthia. After reading the thesis, I know how abundant it is and how frustrating it must be for you to run through only the highlights. So I encourage everyone to really read the whole piece of work. It's a work of important scholarship, and also you find Cynthia's voice within it, making her comments in a very unabashed way from a modern perspective, criticizing which should be criticized in terms of the cultural outlook of the people of three authors who wrote it. As myself, I am also a scholar of Musar, and I told Cynthia that I'm so happy to have read it. It enlightened me, and I would love to have discussions and altercations about certain parts of it. And I think she's making an amazing contribution to Jewish scholarship. And she's one of our blessed students who are always curious and courageous and intellectually brilliant to really discover new ideas and be creative and move us forward to new insights. So thank you, Cynthia, for all you're doing. And we know your path is going to make amazing contributions to the Jewish community. So without further ado, maybe if anyone has any questions, I don't want to dominate this. And I know Cynthia said to me that she only has 21 minutes, so I told her I'd be very brief, so I have to honor that.